Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies and ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start the new session on the EU as a global power. Let me note that when we were preparing the program, the TEPSA Secretariat suggested to us here in Nicosia that we must include it. And I said, yes, we should do it as long as we put a question mark to that, because obviously the way things are today, the European Union has a long way to go before it becomes a global power. And by the way, to make a connection with what has been said so far, and the question of the taxi driver about how he felt towards the Union, what I would say is that many people in Europe, including Cypriots, feel that in the last few years there is less prosperity and less security. And the question is that what steps can be taken so that the European Union can address successfully the challenges ahead and become eventually a global power. Without any further comments, I turn to Her Excellency, the Ambassador of France to Cyprus, Mr. Clélia Chevrier Kolačko. Your Excellency. Maximum 15 minutes each speaker.
Thank you very much. I will begin by saying that the EU must be a global power. I think that's the answer in a way. It has no choice. Europe is at an historic turning point. It must assert its capacity to decide sovereignly, to produce what it needs, and to defend itself. That means Europe must be a global power that is autonomous at all levels, political, economic, and strategic. Why? Because Europe cannot depend on other countries or individuals on key issues. It cannot have other individuals or countries' choices imposed on it. It must defend its own democratic project and its values. And firstly, to not depend on others means to defend its sovereignty in strategic areas, which directly relate to the daily life of Europeans: energy, food, health, industry, security. On energy, Europe must guarantee its energy independence, in particular by reducing its dependency to the Russian gas. And this is what it has been doing since the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. Europe recently set a deadline of 1st January 2027 for ending imports. But this dependence must not be replaced by another, and this requires the revival of civil nuclear power, of massive investment in hydrogen, for instance, in renewables, and also electricity interconnections between member states. On food, Europe must preserve its food sovereignty, in particular by reforming the common agricultural policy to protect producers from social and environmental dumping. On health, our countries are facing a significant risk of drug shortages. Today, 80% of active ingredients in medicines consumed in Europe come from Asia. The EU must relocate the production of medicines and vaccines, now dependent on China and India, and strengthen biomedical research on European soil. On technology, if you look at the data today, only 5% of electric batteries are manufactured in Europe, and Europe has only 3% of computing capacity. That means that it entrusts all of its data to clouds in countries outside the EU, and mainly the US. So Europe must defend its sovereignty, its digital sovereignty, by diversifying suppliers, so as not to be dependent on a few foreign infrastructures that make it vulnerable to geopolitical pressures, such as the remote deactivation of critical systems if geopolitical tension arises. So Europe must build technological sovereignty through coordinated investments in Europe in strategic sectors, such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, or cloud infrastructure. On security and defense, you see that today the main threat to European security is the Russian threat at its borders. But Europe is also on the edge of a crisis arc, stretching from the Sahel to the Middle East and Iran. And the United States has added a degree of uncertainty. So we Europeans must now ensure our own security. Europe must equip itself with a credible deterrent defense system and continue to defend the international law and a very simple principle that aggression doesn't pay. So secondly, apart from defending our sovereignty in strategic areas, not depending on others also means ensuring that choices that run counter to the European project and its values are not imposed on us. Europe is a union of 27 countries with democratic systems, with free societies, with independent justice. It is faced with the emergence of powers with authoritarian and autocratic tendencies, which are rejecting the values the EU is built on. So the EU must defend its model. And in particular, it must protect its citizens from information manipulation and foreign interference, and it must defend democracy. For a long time, democracy has been considered to be based on one pillar, the right to vote. One man, one vote, or one woman, one vote. But democracy, in fact, rests on two pillars. The right to vote, of course, but exercised by fully informed citizens. And because we have forgotten the importance of this second pillar, we have allowed public debate to be relocated to social networks, whose rules are not set democratically, but by billionaires, often Chinese or American, with major consequences to the quality of the debate. Citizens are locked in algorithmic bubbles that hinder their ability to debate really among themselves. Journalists, because of those social media, are also deprived of the resources they need to carry out their mission. And this mission is to enlighten citizens, to inform them. And the public space is fragmented with loopholes through which the virus of disinformation has been inserted. And it is essential to combat this virus, to detect it by identifying foreign interference, and to treat it by sanctioning malicious actors, as well as the social media platforms that enable them to operate. That is why, in 2022, European rules were adopted with the Digital Services Act. And Europe is now also discussing how to establish a digital majority and a mandatory parental control over access to social media in order to protect 50 million young Europeans from the dangers of the digital world, where online harassment, incitement to hatred or suicide claim victims every day. But of course, it's easy to say that Europe must be a global power. Europe must also overcome structural weaknesses. It has to deal with its political and institutional divisions. Europe is a bureaucratic machine where the unanimity rule slows down the rapid adoption of decisions, and it must continue to improve its responsiveness to crisis. But it's visible that it knows also how to answer to crisis when it needs. We saw it during the COVID-19 crisis. We saw it during the first month of the war of aggression against Ukraine. Europe has also lost ground in strategic industrial sectors. It must regain a robust industrial base capable of producing the goods essentials to its defense, but also to the ecological and digital transition. It must increase its joint investment capacity, as it needs to invest several hundred billion euros a year, and to reduce the gap also between national economies, because this gap is also undermining overall cohesion and competitiveness. And Europe knows how to do this. It's the model of Next Generation EU, the largest stimulus package ever financed in Europe, with 750 billion euro to help rebuild it after COVID-19. This is what is at stake now in the negotiations of the next multi-annual financial framework, which will be conducted during Cyprus's EU presidency. Europe must also move away from a defensive regulatory approach and adopt a more power-based approach. It must reduce the overproduction of standards and invest more in research, training, and innovation. But Europe is already a global power in several aspects. Despite its weaknesses, Europe already exerts a unique global influence thanks to its model, its regulation, and its external actions. Europe is indeed a regulatory power, And the EU is helping to raise standards on major issues. Its regulation often influence and eventually become global standards. For instance, more than 130 countries have taken inspiration from the European GDPR for the protection of personal data. And our legislation on artificial intelligence, the Digital Markets Directive, and environmental regulation are influencing global standards because Europe is both a key market and a place where standards are produced that respond positively to global challenges. And this ability to set global standards is a form of legal and ethical sovereignty. Europe is also a leader in ecological transition. It is the only region aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050 with legally binding targets. And it has planned to double its financial capacity for this transition. Launched in 2022, the Repower EU plan helps the EU to save energy, to diversify its energy supply, and to produce clean energy. We have also the European Green Deal and the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which are illustrating its pioneering role and have a spillover effect on countries. Europe is also a military power, even if under construction. Europe has increased its military action capability. The EU and its member states have provided more than 63 billion euro in military support to Ukraine, and more than 80,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been trained since 2022. And with a coalition of volunteers, for the first time in history, you have European countries, but also Asian and North American countries, which have decided to pool military resources so that when a ceasefire is reached in Ukraine, peace can be guaranteed and European security can be assured. This is not done in a logic of aggression or escalation, but in a logic of defense. Defense of Ukraine, defense of European territory. Europe is also consolidating a true Europe of defense with a SAFE program, which pools arms productions and the strengthening of its defense industrial and technological base. But the development of a common culture of defense, of strategy, must also be pursued in order to enable coordinated interventions. Europe is also a global donor. Europe remains the world's leading contributor of official development and humanitarian aid. And it's really facing all the crises and emergency situations with a lot of energy and a huge amount of aid. However, it must gain geopolitical visibility through greater communication because too often this aid is not visible enough and is not put to our credit. And finally, Europe is a power of attraction. The EU attracts talent, investment, innovation, thanks to its political stability, its huge integrated market of 700 million consumers, and its dynamic academic and technological hubs. And you just have to see the numerous applications for EU membership from the Balkans, Ukraine, and Moldova. They demonstrate the appeal of the European model. The migration challenge Europe faces is also clearly showing that its model is attractive. You have nearly 400,000 non-European students welcomed into higher education in Europe every year, and more than 35% of investment in European startups come from countries outside Europe. So yes, Europe is already a global power in many ways. It can overcome its weaknesses. It has already shown in the past its resilience and its ability to adapt in times of crisis. And in any case, Europe has no other choice.
Thank you very much. Thought-provoking presentation, which raises, thinking and many questions. But I will now turn to Revecca Pedi, Associate Professor at the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki, Greece. And while I'll ask her to address the same topic, I will just add one question, if I may. While the European Union is on its way to also become a global actor, as the ambassador says, under construction, the military aspect, and in this complex world, how do small countries like Cyprus protect themselves from a NATO neighborhood? And like a medium country like Greece, how does it do so against the same neighbor NATO member? Thank you. I turn to you, Revecca.
By being EU member states, I guess. It's my first answer, but I'm going to respond to the question later. Thank you so much for the invitation and for organizing this great event and giving us time to reflect on EU's role in the world. When I first saw the title of our panel, the EU as a global power, ? I couldn't help noticing that the most important part, it is not about the EU, it is not about power, but it is a question mark you have there. Because the EU is without doubt a global actor. It shapes markets, sets standards, regulates technologies, funds development, as the ambassador said, the biggest donor, and influences climate policy. But is it a global power in the sense that it affects the behavior of others, not by its existence simply, but by its example, its ambition, its ability to make others adjust to the European way. And if it is, I think there's a second, more uncomfortable question. Power for whom and for whose sake? Why does it matter if the European Union is a global power, if the taxi driver across Europe, not only in Nicosia, thinks that it isn't? And are we going to talk today about the European Union on the couch? If you look from Nicosia, Athens, Tallinn, mainly small states, as you said, or even Warsaw, and I guess these days from Paris too. I don't know about London, I'm sorry. It looks like a power. It gives 27 small and middle powers a voice in world affairs. It provides economic, diplomatic, societal shelter, enabling its members to act bigger than they are alone. In that sense, the EU is an order of its own inside the multi-order world, a community built on peace, prosperity, and democracy. And allow me to say that for 450 million Europeans, the European way is a right, but it is taken for granted these days. From the inside, this is power, collective influence that no member could exercise alone. But if you look from Washington, Beijing, Moscow, or London, and even from Ankara, the image changes. The EU is seen not as a power, but as a secondary actor, a regulatory giant with little muscle. Its European way is no longer exportable, sometimes even seen as incompatible with the realities of a shifting world. An easy target for some states. Michael Smith said it a decade ago, the EU is out of its comfort zone. Its transformative power and Brussels effect have faded, and the liberal regulatory model it once championed not longer sets the tone. Competing orders, many, illiberal, sovereignty-based, and they all challenging the EU's example. The world is moving on, but Europe hasn't fully adapted. And for me, the real danger is not how others see the EU. It's the growing distance between the way the EU sees itself and how the world sees the EU. The gap is widening. No doubt is growing inside the Union too. Remember the taxi drivers. The EU no longer dictates development in its own neighborhood. not in Western Balkans, not in Turkey, not in Ukraine or Gaza. It reacts more than it leads. It is shaped by developments more than it shapes them. And the perception of inability is growing into European public opinion. The capabilities expectations gap is growing. And what is more, there is disillusionment with globalization that fuels Euroscepticism, while many Europeans identify themselves with anti-globalist rhetoric or even Trumpian rhetoric. I have a story, not with a taxi driver, but with a carpenter we hired for the renovation of our apartment, who said to me, I'm a Trumpian. And thanks. And the guy who brought the marbles for the apartment said to me also that he is a Trumpian, beside the fact that he is affected because he cannot export marbles to the United States. And I don't think that it's admiration for Trump or love for Trump. It's a feeling that the European way of life doesn't deliver anymore. The European project feels distant to many of its European citizens, and the European way less compelling. But the European way at the same time is taken for granted. They take the water in the Mediterranean for granted, and they think that someone will take care of it. And they cannot understand that it's the EU that has to take care of it. Let's go back to the EU as a global power. And let's be honest, the EU was never designed to be a global power. It was built to prevent Europe from destroying itself again, to secure peace, prosperity, and democracy. And it succeeded. That success created the circumstances, the potential for its global actorness, its power of attraction, as the ambassador said before, was the most potent form of power Europe ever had. But today, the foundational trinity of prosperity, peace, and democracy is under strain. Peace is broken on our borders. Prosperity, even basic economic security, feels uncertain, and democracy is challenged at home. The European way of life begins to lose its gravitational pull. And allow me to say that the question is not whether the EU is a global power, but whether it can still deliver to its citizens. Its global power matters only insofar as it strengthens its capacity to deliver peace, prosperity, and democracy at home. If the EU cannot deliver for Europeans, it will not survive, and it will not inspire anyone beyond Europe. So restoring credibility at home is not a distraction from global power. It's the foundation of the EU's global power. However, let's be honest again, the EU confronts a shrinking space for actorness. Externally, the EU space for action is narrowing. The transatlantic relationship, once a natural shelter for European integration, is strained. The multilateral system, the EU's playground, is fragmenting. For decades, Europe's influence was multiplied by the liberal order and by transatlantic unity. Now that both are weakening, Europe's relative power contracts. Power politics is back and challenges European Union's pacifist DNA, while technology advancement has become the new battlefield. Sometimes it seems that the status quo mindset leaves the EU ill-equipped to confront the revision of the liberal order and revisionist powers. The EU's internal strength, its laws, markets, institutions, contrast with its external fragility. It remains a civilian power in a world of hard edges. It is a huge straight bloc in a world of protectionism. It lacks resources in a world where interdependence is weaponized. Strategic autonomy is more an aspiration than an achievement. So, this can be told as a story of decline or nostalgia. The narrative of failure that Dr. Eric Jones mentioned before. But if we look at the EU's history, it can be also a call for reinvention, because the story of the EU is a story of reinvention. The end of transatlantic naivete is not a choice, it's a condition. Strategic autonomy must stop being a catchphrase and become a strategy. That means strengthening defense, not as militarization, but as self-reliance. Leveraging economic power, not as protectionism, but as a tool for resilience. Defending democracy, not as a rhetoric, but through tangible social and economic inclusion. And it also means take initiatives on Ukraine, the Middle East, climate, and above all, technology. In this context, and despite what others tell, the EU doesn't need to abandon its DNA, its normative power. It needs to defend and adapt it. Its regulatory power still matters, but only if it serves a strategic purpose, shaping its surroundings and influencing global norms. If regulation becomes self-referential, then it will be an obstacle. The EU risks self-sabotaging itself, becoming a spectator in a world changing without it. Its task is to connect its European order, its internal order, with the external world, making the European way relevant again. That's the essence of European power, the ability to create value out of constraint. And this is where European Union's power is. We need partners, again, as Dr. Eric Jones said before, but we need partners that respect our rules and our values. If any country wants to benefit from the European order, it has to play with the European rules of the game. And if the EU wants to be a global power, it has to transform its values into leverage. Let me conclude by saying that the EU should reclaim its entrepreneurial power. The EU has always been an entrepreneurial power, a status quo actor that turned crisis into creativity and limitations into leadership. It fostered norm entrepreneurship, policy innovation, and institutional imagination, and used them to generate value for itself and for others. That's what the EU must do again, reimagine peace, prosperity, and democracy for the perma-crisis era. And peace today is not only about the absence of war, it's about resilience and security. Prosperity is no longer just growth, it's about sustainable competitiveness. Democracy cannot survive on procedure alone. It must be experienced by every citizen across Europe. This is what entrepreneurial power means in our time, to reinvent Europe's founding promises, not to replace them and not to abandon them, to make peace proactive, prosperity inclusive, and democracy participatory. The EU can become a global power by delivering at home. And delivering security for small states across Europe is a cornerstone of the EU's mandate today to respond to your question. Of course, self-help is back. Of course, spending on armaments is back, but we need to guarantee that the European Union will continue to be a shelter for its member state, and upholding its values and its normative power. I think it's an important step for becoming a true global power. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pedi. Thank you, Revecca. I now turn to Dr. Ian Bond.
No, I'm not a doctor.
I added that. Who is Deputy Director for the Center for European Reform in London.
No.
While you address the same topic, what I would specifically ask you is the following. It's a question with two dimensions. One, in the past, we were used to think about European security within the framework of the Euro-Atlantic relationship. That's number one. And second, with the new developments and the way forward, and Europe seeking to upgrade its role as a global power and a global actor, how would you see its relations with the United States of America, with China and Russia? Thank you.
Thank you. The trouble with speaking last is that almost everything that I wanted to say has already been said, which will at least make me perhaps rather shorter than I would otherwise have been. But you've also given me some interesting things to talk about. Look, let me start by saying that one of the things that's been most frustrating about this discussion, from the point of view of a Brit, is the conflation of the EU with Europe. The EU is a very important part of Europe. It is not Europe. And I do think it's quite important to remember that. It's also important for the Brits to remember that the EU is an important part of Europe and we can't ignore it. But I think if you treat everything that goes on this continent as being the EU, you're going to lose some friends and you're going to have more problems. Anyway, that's one point. The second point, I thought it was fascinating that the ambassador said Europe has to be a global power. And Professor Pedi said the EU was not designed to be a global power. And I think both of those things are true. And they give Europe a problem. So my involvement with EU affairs started almost 30 years ago. I was the Deputy European Correspondent in the Common Foreign and Security Policy Department of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So it was my job to try to ensure that our foreign policy incorporated the EU into itself, and that our foreign policy interests were represented in the EU. And in my first 3 months of the job, I was involved in negotiating a common position on imposing an arms embargo on the Taliban in Afghanistan. And I was involved in drafting a common position jointly with the Spanish delegation on promoting democracy in Cuba. Well, Here we are. You may have noticed that the Taliban are still in power in Afghanistan and they don't seem to be short of weapons, and Cuba is still not a democracy. Maybe that was a one-off. So a couple of years later, in a different job, I was responsible, together with the German presidency, for helping to draft the EU's first common strategy, the common strategy on relations with Russia. And the EU set itself two strategic goals: a stable, open and pluralistic democracy in Russia, governed by the rule of law and underpinning a prosperous market economy benefiting alike all the people of Russia and of the European Union. And second objective, maintaining European stability, promoting global security, and responding to the common challenges of the continent through intensified cooperation with Russia. I guess we were all pretty terrible diplomats. So I have subsequently left the Foreign Office, left the Foreign Service. I'm sure that my successors are doing so much better. So what is the EU's role in the Gaza peace settlement, if there is to be one? The answer is, it seems to be nothing, except possibly writing the checks at the end. Despite the fact that the EU is Israel's biggest trading partner and the biggest donor to the Palestinian Authority, the Union has had absolutely no influence whatsoever on either the situation on the ground or on the diplomacy that has followed the fighting. We need to ask ourselves, why is that? What about other conflicts? The EU has people on the ground, 200 people on the ground, along the line between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And yet when the presidents of Armenia and Azerbaijan wanted somebody to witness the signing, or sorry, the initialing, I should say, of their peace agreement, where did they go? They went to the White House. They didn't go to Brussels. The EU was completely sidelined from the diplomatic process. What about the war in Ukraine? The EU has been, and I'm very glad of it, the major economic donor, keeping Ukraine's economy afloat for the last 3.5 years. This year, it is the major military donor as well, because the US has more or less pulled out of that. And yet, what have we been able to achieve? This is a battle on our doorstep, and we have not been able to stop the Russians advancing through Ukraine. Donald Tusk, very correctly in my view, asked, why is it that 500 million Europeans are asking 300 million Americans to defend them against 140 million Russians? We are not a global power. We are not even a regional power. Sorry, you. We're not even part of this. We're barely a power in our own backyard. So I think there is a really, the EU likes to comfort itself with the idea that it is a regulatory superpower. The fact is that its its ability to be a regulatory superpower is fading fast. China is becoming the regulatory superpower for areas like AI, magnets. China is imposing its standards in areas like autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles. We are not. We are becoming importers of China's standards. That's not a good thing. So I'm not sure that I have answers to all of these problems, but I will just say a few things that I think you have to fix. The first is, and I simply don't know how you do this, you have to fix the problem of unanimity in foreign policy. The problem is, the treaty is quite clear. You can fix this problem if you can get the unanimous agreement of the 27 to move away from unanimity. That seems quite unlikely at the moment. I don't see any sign that countries like Hungary or Slovakia are going to give up their vetoes. In fact, if anything, the veto powers seem to be growing in number, not shrinking. But somehow you have to do that. If you can overcome that, the next thing that the EU has to do is to make sure that it is setting realistic objectives and providing adequate means. There is a tendency to set very ambitious goals and attribute very unambitious means. And one example of that is the Global Gateway. The Global Gateway was supposed to be a rival to the Belt and Road Initiative. Ask yourselves, is it working? No. China has become the dominant trading and investment partner for about half the countries in the world. At the same time, the EU is losing influence in the global south. The Global Gateway is a great idea, noble ambitions, grossly under-resourced, and barely featuring when ministers from individual member states go out into the world, which is, I mean, that's another problem. But most member states' governments still, when they go outside the EU, are trying to present themselves nationally. They're not trying to present the Union. Second thing I think that the EU needs to overcome is a belief that rhetoric is reality. So a few years ago, not long after the start of the Syrian civil war, I did a bit of research on what the EU had been doing. In the first 2 years of the war, the EU had issued more than 100 statements. It had issued more than one statement every single week in the first 2 years of the Syrian civil war. It had achieved absolutely nothing on the ground. Assad was just as brutal. The opposition were equally brutal. The fighting was just as terrible. Refugees were leaving at the same pace. The gap between the rhetoric and the reality was shocking. Why was that? It was partly because the EU had no leverage. And the EU had no leverage in part because it had never wanted to be a military power, but without any hard power to bring to bear, it had very little chance of influencing the situation on the ground. Now, I think we are forced to do more in the military sphere. And here I do mean we, not just you, not just the EU, but Europeans as a whole, because we cannot rely on the US. It's not just a Donald Trump problem. It's the fact that Americans have voted twice for Donald Trump. They are not really that interested in the problems of our part of the world. And we are not, I fear, going to see that change, even if there is a change of administration in 2029. So Europeans have to work together to develop the firepower to be able to defend themselves and their interests within their own region, let alone within the wider world. And then I suppose the final thing is we have to learn, you have to learn. I keep saying we, I can't get this out of my head even after 5 years. The EU has to learn to use the economic power that it has effectively. The EU has imposed 19 packages of sanctions on Russia, but it has been the drip of small droplets of water dropping on a large block of concrete. It has never been the flood that would sweep away the block of concrete. Europe was afraid to use the powers that it had in its arsenal. It was afraid to cut off Russian oil and gas from the beginning of the war because of the economic consequences that that would have for us. The EU has just done an exceptionally unfavorable trade deal with the US because not the Commission was at fault, but because the member states said to the Commission, don't deprive us of the US security umbrella that we rely on. The Commission had its hands tied in the deal that it did with the US. The EU is the world's third largest economy, but it's acting like, I don't know, you can't say midget any longer. An economic, inch high economically, 2.5 centimeters to those of you who don't operate in inches. Yeah, so the last thing I will say is I think that the EU also has to strengthen its ties with other democratic states, and that includes the UK, but not just the UK. There are like-minded states in the world. Not all of them are in Europe, some of them are. Some of them are further afield. But I think that the EU has to start thinking about how do you use the like-mindedness of countries like Canada and so on to extend the reach that you have and to deal with some of the problems that you have. And this is where I will return to the question of China. If China dominates the global market in rare earths, but countries like Canada and Australia and Japan have either significant quantities of rare earths or have the technological capability to process them and to turn them into the magnets and the batteries and so on that we need, then why are we not working more closely with them? We're getting there, but it's very, very slow. You know, the Americans have signed an agreement with Japan on rare earths and the products of rare earth elements. Where is the corresponding European agreement? So there are friends out there in the world, use them, and where you have enemies or rivals, be prepared to use the leverage that you have. And don't forget about us. We are still out there on the periphery of Europe. We still have some things to offer, particularly in the defense and defense industrial space. Don't let it all be about fishing rights and whether or not European students have to pay full fees when they come to the UK for university study. These things are important, but they're also in some ways, compared with the scale of the challenges in the world at the moment, at the trivial end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very interesting points. Allow me to say one thing. When, during the time that Greece was about to become a member of the Union, and Cyprus subsequently, the perception in Greece and Cyprus was that European Union, in one way or another, would address issues and perspectives that would solve problems and make us better off. The practice, though, has been that Germany was thinking first about Germany and then European Union, France the same. And that's why you cannot, that's why the issue of unanimity comes in the veto or else. So small states, if they're guaranteed prosperity and security, they can go along to forget about their veto, but if not, why give it up? I will say no more. We have 5 minutes for questions. I will start with my colleague Michalis Kondos and go to the lady there. You don't have the lady there, yes?
Thank you. My name is Ksenia Hortova, and I'm the head of Community of Ukrainian Cypriot Friendship. I really think that among this panel should be a Ukrainian representative, as Ukraine is part of Europe. And I think that Europe as a whole, including Britain, should treat the danger very seriously. For now, I don't think that Europeans treat the danger really seriously. Because we have the example of how Europe acts when it treats seriously. It was during COVID. People were made to make jabs in order to be able to go in public. And now we speak and Ukrainians pay for every speech. Ukrainians pay with lives. It is my country where people die every day. And you keep speaking.
Thank you.
I mean, you have the instruments to deal with the problems. Use them, please.
Thank you. Mr. Tilliros, I will give you the right to ask a question if you ask a question and not make a speech. If you promise, okay. Okay.
Thank you and congratulations to all the speakers. First, let me clarify. I don't need them.
No, you will. Styliana determines the rules here, not you.
I know you're always hard on me, but let me obey the rules. Okay. First, let me clarify that I'm not a Russian fan, but for fairness' sake, I would like to play the devil's advocate. In what sense, Your Excellency, Ambassador of France, does France feel threatened by Russia? I mean, Napoleon did invade Russia in 1812, but Russia never invaded France. The billions of euros, the hundreds of billions of euros spent on the war could well be used to increase the living standards of the European Union, of the European citizens. And I mean, Mrs. Pedi gave a lot of ideas where they could be spent. And then to Mr. Bond, I would like you, whose views were excellent and well balanced and fair. Could you please, I would like to hear that from a British man. Could you please rationalize the historical hatred of the UK of Russia? And why doesn't the EU, final question, show or display the same sensitivity about Cyprus occupation by Turkey? But in Ukraine, which is a similar situation, they make all this fuss.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No more questions. I will start from Revecca. Go this way now.
Okay, thank you. Quite provocative question for me to answer, I admit. And I have to say, if we want the EU to stand for Cyprus, or for Greece, or for Estonia, we have to stand by Ukraine. And the money spent in Ukraine, they are well spent from my perspective as a scholar who studies small states that seek shelter from bigger organizations. That said, I think that what we are doing was quite belated. We had to stop Russia or any other power that threatens a European member state or EU's near abroad before an attack. We need to have a deterrent power. And I think what a success would be for the EU if it stopped Putin in 2014, if we stopped import gas in 2014, and okay, not stop importing gas, but start working on our strategic autonomy. And I think we need to think of it when we discuss about SAFE and any other European initiative that welcomes other states.
Thank you, Mr. Bond.
Yeah. I'm not going to start on all of the history, but I would say that, at various times we have been allied with Russia and against Turkey, and at other times we've been allied with Turkey and against Russia. At the moment, we and Turkey are both NATO members, and I mean, I wouldn't say there was any hatred of Russia. I don't hate Russia. I've lived in Russia. I still have Russian friends. Most of the Russian friends that I have are now in the West, and some of the people that I knew and was friendly with are dead. Some of them at the hands of Putin. So, I think what I'm looking at the moment is our interests and our interests in defending NATO. And I don't think that Putin's ambitions are confined to Ukraine, although his reach at the moment may be confined to Ukraine. So, yeah, perhaps I'll leave it there.
Okay, the ambassador.
Yes, I fully agree with you. And I think the threats were publicly told by Russia. You just have to look at everything what was in the media in recent years. It was a threat of using nuclear weapons. It was the threat of using missiles. We have drones in our aerial space. There is a war of disinformation against Europe in general, and very specifically against France. We have very well documented now because we are working on that. Now we have a specific department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs working on that because the threat is so important that we have to put all our diplomacy also against this threat of disinformation, and it's visible also on the democracy. There are threats against democracy, and Moldova and Romania saw also how disinformation and the use of social media can be a threat for democracy. And Russia is here. It's behind this. We know it, we see it, we have all the proofs for it. And in various times, we negotiated with Russia in the past, and we had confidence when they act against Georgia, when they act against Ukraine in the past, and each time it was okay, we'll stop now, everything's fine, and then they came again. So why would they stop now? Yes, it's a danger, it's a threat, it's a national threat.
Okay, thank you. This session has been completed. Perhaps we are wiser, but with more questions. What we will do right now is to have 25 minutes break, and we come back at 4 o'clock, sharp on time for the next session. Thank you.